Very warm welcome to everyone joining this morning. I'm delighted to have Giles Gibbons, Chair of the SRA and also founder of Good Business here today, and Anya Doherty, who is founder of Foodsteps. We're going to be discussing how to attract customers through communicating sustainability and what are the different ways of communicating sustainability. One of the things that I found, sorry, I should just briefly explain to anyone who haven't met me before. I'm the founder of Trident Supplied and have also been organizing this conference. Trident Supplied focuses on supply chain efficiency and sustainability. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is how can restaurants really benefit from all the good work that they do, so that we're not just relying on them to just do the good thing, and how can we help them to communicate what they're doing really well. 1 second, I'm just going to disable the waiting room so people can join without waiting for me to admit them. I wanted to start the conversation with a broad discussion around what are the different ways of communicating sustainability. And this actually came partly from a conversation I had with David Chinnery, who you may have met through some of the other sessions the last 2 days, about different methods. So we're kind of looking at how they're divided into quantitative, qualitative, and narrative ways of communication. Anya and Giles, do you want to kind of share your thoughts on what are the differences between those types of communication and where you think that they have advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to jump in, and then I'll pass over to Giles. Yeah, great to have everyone here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So yeah, as Dominique sort of pointed out, I think there are really two broad categories of ways to communicate sustainability. One is the quantitative, so looking at metrics like carbon footprint, land use, water use, and that's really getting as far as possible to a specific number. So, what is the carbon footprint of this dish? What's the land use of this dish? How much water has been required to create this dish? And the other side is the qualitative. So sustainability is such a broad church. There's so much that goes into that, and it might be things like our specific kind of tags, like is this organic? Has it been reared in a certain way? What were some of the social and kind of human aspects that went into that. And I think so my broad answer would be that it is going to take a little bit of both. So some of the benefits of quantitative, so putting a number on things, is that it kind of stops this ability for people to kind of hide behind non-sustainable dishes. So if you've got such a massive selection of qualitative things to choose from, it's quite easy for people to kind of put up their best foot forward and say, oh, my dish is local or organic or whatever, but it might not take into account the full picture. So some of the quantitative measures like carbon footprint and land use really try to cut across that and say, okay, maybe it's local and that's really great, but actually you need to look at other things as well that go into the footprint there. But I would say from some of our research, so I led a trial in Cambridge into carbon labelling and the effects of that on people's decisions. What we found was that it did have an impact on the food that people were choosing, so they did choose more sustainable options. But the driving factor behind that was actually their emotional kind of response to the labels. So we found that people who responded more emotionally to the labels chose more sustainable options, whereas those that didn't, actually, it didn't affect their behavior. So what that kind of tells us is that there's more kind of going on than just the numbers. It isn't just about kind of putting, X kilograms of CO2 on a menu. You have to contextualize that and give people more of a narrative, because from our research, it tends to be that emotional response that's actually driving people's changes. But yeah, anyway, that's a bit of an overview, and I'll pass to Giles for his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I think the first thing to say is that it is incredibly important to communicate what you're doing as part of the whole sort of ecosystem of a business, be it a restaurant or another, making changes and ensuring that those changes are understood by people in order that people can make a decision, a positive decision based on what you're doing. That too much of sort of businesses say, oh, well, I just like, people just to sort of, find it out for themselves. And then we need to crush that concept. You need to make the changes, show that you're different to what other people are doing, and in order that people can make a positive change in the right direction in terms of where they might want to go and eat, what they might eat when they're there, as Anya says. So the sort of fundamental, communicating sustainability isn't just patting themselves on the back. It is a part of the process of creating change and helping consumers make better decisions. When we set up the SRA 13 years ago, there was an increasing amount of information that people were putting on the menu. And one of the reasons why we felt that we needed to create a sustainability rating, which is what we have now, which is a 3-star rating, was that diners said to us, we don't want to sort of be lectured. We don't want it to be a sort of academic exercise going to a restaurant. We're going there for fun, for entertainment, to enjoy ourselves, not to feel like we're going into the classroom. And so the concept behind the rating was that, in a sense, we could take the hard work for the consumer out of the debate. So they could feel reassured by going to a 3-star sustainability rated restaurant that restaurant was making good decisions on their behalf from a sustainability perspective. And to a certain degree, I think that, as you say, quantitatively, I think that has worked and we can provide that reassurance. But I think it really only works well when the restaurant is also finding a narrative, a conversation with the consumer in the walls of the building, on the menu, in their overall story that they are telling about their restaurant, to really engage people in what it means to them and how they're delivering it. So I do think this sort of combination of a quantitative reassurance, either on specific issues, as Anya was saying, in relation to carbon or water use, but an overarching quantitative commitment that we're covering all these bases in lots of different ways, and that's why we've got an overall rating. But also remembering that we need to story tell as well, and that can be a positive part of the dining experience.
I saw a really good example of that, Giles, with one of your members. I went to go and have dinner at Lussman's, and I can't remember which restaurant it was, either the Harpenden or the St Albans one, but they had information about the supply chain printed on the walls, and particularly in the toilets, actually. So it was quite an educational experience just going to the loo there. And actually that was a much better place in a way to put the information than on the menu, because you're there by yourself. You're not trying to interact with your friends at the same time. Well, some people might, but mostly you're going by yourself, and you've got the time to absorb that information and to think about it. And so I just felt, for me at least, that was a really good way of communicating the narrative of the story and making use of space that is otherwise often so neglected.
Yeah. So I think that thinking about the total diner journey in relation to sustainability communications is fundamentally important. It's like, what we're not talking about is shoving all of this on the menu. I think otherwise you're being sort of thrown by the science, and it's sort of too much. And that a lot of discussion about whether we should have calories on there, whether what information should be on the menu. I think what the problem is that the menu is being focused on as having to do too much of the work, in a sense. Particularly in the world in which we're in now, where social media and digital play an incredibly important part. Most people are booking the restaurant through a digital platform. They're identifying which restaurants they want to go through to digitally. they following chefs. There's a huge amount of ways in which you can build the story about what's important to you as a restaurateur, as a chef, what you're doing, how you're doing it in that whole journey, not just in the moment where you're actually, everyone's under pressure. They need you to make a decision about what you're going to buy. You're having to make a decision about what you're going to order. And that really, I think, isn't the place to be providing too much information.
Yeah, I think I definitely would, sort of echo what Giles is saying there, because I think one of the dangers with, putting too much information kind of, forward is it's kind of putting all the pressure on the consumer to kind of, deal with, nutrition, sustainability, and there are kind of, 10 different or 20 different factors in each one of those. And actually, we very much think that it is up to the, the restaurants and the establishments. They're the ones who are kind of providing that, service and food to people, and they've got, hopefully, not very much, but a bit more time to think about these things. So very much agree, it can't be about kind of, shoving all that information kind of on the consumer's plate. But at the same time, particularly in the kind of younger generation, so in the university context, we have actually seen requests from students for more information. So they want to have something when they go into the cafeterias and into that dining setting, that reassures them that this is something that's being taken into account. So it is a question about, how do you do that in a tasteful way, and in a way that isn't kind of lecturing people or shoving information down their throats. But even kind of in that setting, it can be really hard to get people to take notice of those interventions. So in Sheffield, University of Sheffield, they put a sort of low impact kind of sticker on some of their cafeteria meals as a way to try and respond to that student sort of drive to have more information. And what was interesting was they, in their sort of follow-up study, found that only about 35 or 40% of people had actually said they'd seen those stickers. And I think that's really saying something about kind of what happens when consumers sort of go into a place. We're all on autopilot and kind of default, and we're probably just looking at the food and sort of deciding what we want there. And yeah, hopefully later in this talk we'll have a chance to speak about some of the kind of non-informative interventions. So things like changing the setting in which food is served, changing the order in which things are served, changing how you actually place things on the menu, and those sort of subtle kind of system architecture things can also be really effective without kind of just going information forward.
I think all of those points are very important, just to think about the whole journey, and some of what you were saying about not noticing the kind of information and being overload of attention is very true. One of the things I was thinking, you were both talking, is whether there's an opportunity to make use of waiting space to create. So a lot of people are much more familiar with QR codes, especially the younger generation, and being able to have something they can actually interact with while they're waiting. So not every restaurant will have a place where you have to wait to be seated for your table. But again, the queues for the loos are also a right pain if you've got one. And it could make it a lot more fun if there's a QR code on the wall that you can interact with and learn about the supply chain, the other factors that the restaurants do in terms of energy efficient lighting, etc. So I think one of the things we've done in the development of our product is to ensure that all of our supplier profiles have a public facing version, so that they can easily be used on QR codes to kind of for restaurants to demonstrate their transparency and traceability. So I think there's a huge opportunity to think about where to place these, and to Giles' point about not being on menus, and thinking about the diner experience. It's very much when you're sat down and you're looking at the menu, I always find that it's always a bit distracting, because actually what you really want to do is talk to your friends. And in many ways, it's beneficial to the restaurant if you can get people to make their decisions before they arrive, and that the information that you can give people in advance helps them to feel confident before they arrive that they've chosen the right restaurant to go into. And to Anya's point about, you know, younger people wanting that reassurance, doesn't help with walk-ins, of course, but you know, it does help if people are actually looking online to decide where they're going to go, and potentially even buy their meal or book their meal in advance.
Yeah, well, you talked, Dominique, about one of the things that came up yesterday in one of the sessions was, you know, the sort of rise of ticketing as a concept for restaurants, and in a sense, that's a sort of perfect way that you can start the conversation with the diner that much earlier, and that they can sort of, you know, form part of the process is understanding more about the sustainability of the choices and that they can make, and that you can really build a much more sort of bigger experience out of one meal than simply turning up at the meal and ordering and having it. I mean, one of the things it reminds me of is what people say about the experiences that people have about holidays, which is a third of the enjoyment of a holiday is making the holiday, a third of it is having the holiday, and a third is looking back on the pictures with your friends about the holiday that you've had. And in a sense, if we can sort of achieve that from a restaurant perspective, that the excitement comes in terms of, you know, deciding where you're going with friends, buying a ticket, potentially ordering based on much more information about what you're going to eat, and excited about it prior to the experience, having the experience and then being able to talk about it afterwards. I think almost, I mean, it's obviously not for every restaurant, but that just shows how actually sustainability and the sort of information behind the meal can actually help you form a much longer and bigger experience for the diner.
Yeah, there was a really interesting group in Colorado who actually looked at a farmer's market. They tested lots of different things to sort of see how it impacted sales and people kind of coming to the farmer's market. And one of the things they did was they handed out flyers for some of the farmers, just, you know, with a simple kind of picture of the farmer and a bit of a story. And it took a bit of a while, so it took kind of 1 or 2 weeks, but they did find a 40% increase in sales for those stalls that were actually giving information about, you know, who was kind of growing the food and things like that. So I think that speaks to your point, Dominique, about the, you know, what you guys are doing with the, you know, supplier information and having that photo and kind of information available. And I think there is a real opportunity to kind of bring that into the dining experience. I think what, you know, we're all figuring out at the moment is kind of how to do that. So, you know, QR codes are one way. You know, you mentioned kind of queuing and, you know, for the bathroom, or, you know, whatever it is. And now we've suddenly got this massive shift to home deliveries and things like that. So where that information is best placed is, you know, I think something that's still kind of jury's out on that. We've got a couple of different projects going on where, you know, we're trying out different things, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of share that information going forward about, you know, which ones have worked and why. But it's a really interesting point.
That would be really interesting, Anya, if you're able to post that later on in the community once you've got that information. I'm sure lots of people would be interested to see the data.
Absolutely.
Anya, you make an important point there, which it'd be worth bringing out, that the believability of how much an organization cares about these issues isn't just down to the data. So, for example, you know, many restaurants were putting, you know, their delicious food that could be very sustainable into home delivery, but then putting that home delivery into a plastic container that then arrives at the diner's house. And as a consequence of that, the consumer discounts what they've learned on one side, because it doesn't seem like the restaurant is really caring on another side. And I do think that's really important in this discussion, that the restaurants recognize that although they can't be everything, you know, and dealing with all of these issues to the same level, it is really important that you look at not discounting your efforts in one area by not thinking about other things. So there's a key sort of balance there of people believing that this is across the board rather than just in one particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that would be really interesting to talk about, kind of going back to that first discussion we had about qualitative versus quantitative, is, the risk of, greenwashing and kind of mislabeling things, but also the reverse of that, which is that, as Giles said, often things are really sustainable and, you can't be perfect, and you might have to package that kind of in, plastic to extend its shelf life, or just for, for food safety reasons. But how do you really cut across all of that noise and get the message, to the people eating, that, you have taken sort of the right steps. And I think, kind of on that greenwashing piece, I think there is a real, kind of risk that we're all, could be culpable in, of kind of putting our, best foot forward when it comes to sustainability, but not being really transparent about the whole picture. And, it is really easy to kind of go and say, we're doing these two things, but is that actually, is that actually covering the fact that you might be sort of, sweeping other things under the rug? And again, kind of the same group actually in Colorado, they did some sort of, testing on greenwashing. And I think what they're increasingly finding is that, older people sort of tend to be more trusting of sustainability claims, but they've been finding sort of, younger generations are increasingly kind of skeptical about sustainability and different claims sort of being put forward. And I think that's one thing which possibly lends itself slightly better to the kind of a quantitative approach, and sort of that vetting of restaurants, where you have someone like the SRA or people coming in and saying, we've done all this vetting, here's the kind of stuff, and you don't have to think about it too much, because it's confusing all the time to have 20 different claims being made all the time about sustainability, and particularly when things aren't perfect, if they're kind of wrapped in plastic, but they are fantastically sustainable ingredients, that can be really confusing to people, and not easy to kind of get a clear message across, I think.
I think sometimes just kind of transparency as well. It's kind of strong honesty. I remember it was OXO, I think, who were talking after the plastic straws thing that came in, and everyone was suddenly thinking about how to replace plastic straws. They had a whole load of plastic straws, and what do they do with them? Is it more sustainable to use them first, or just throw them away? And I think sometimes the kind of just honesty around, well, we want to actually make, at least give them some use before they get thrown away. They're already here. That's the alternative. Sometimes just being clearly, just saying what you've thought about it. I think that's the key thing, is that you've thought about it, and even though the end result might not immediately appear like the most sustainable result, if you're very clear about your thought process and your reasoning, and make that obvious in what you're doing, I think that can really help, because it kind of increases the believability of what they're doing. And I think even statistics, and particularly this year, we've seen a lot of statistics, and some of them seem to have been contradictory, and so it really understanding the figures as much as anything else is also something that people might be a bit skeptical of. But that actually brings me on to one of my next questions that I wanted to ask you, Anya, which is around kind of carbon calculation and kind of how you're looking at achieving net zero. What are the ways that businesses calculate carbon, and are there any assumptions made in that?
Yeah, so I think what we're increasingly seeing, and it's really exciting, is very much this push for food businesses to engage in the climate kind of narrative, and really kind of be involved in that drive to net zero, which is really exciting. I think food is a really challenging sector to do that in. People have to eat, and it's incredibly complicated, the life cycle of food, all the way from farm to fork. So Yeah, I mean, our work is really in trying to kind of simplify that process and help people to calculate the emissions of their food, and Giles is on a similar track as well. The big thing with net zero is it isn't just about the emissions of the food itself. It is everything from scope 1 to scope 3, and that includes kind of operational impacts as well as the food itself. But from our work, we're finding that for food businesses, if you're kind of restaurant, particularly kind of even online retailers, the food itself probably makes up something like 70 to 90% of of your full emissions base, and that means that it's really important to engage with the footprint of the food itself as far as possible, and that has to be the key kind of area in which decisions are made, in which reduction is put forward, and things like operational impacts will tend to be kind of lower and on the kind of back foot, really. But food, as I said, is a really difficult thing to measure the carbon footprint of. We've spent a lot of time creating a average British impacts database, so that allows food companies to kind of say, okay, this is, if we're buying a tomato in the UK, what's the average impact of that, and taking into account trade data, where those tomatoes are likely to come from, and things like that. And I think, yeah, sort of our advice would be to really try and use the best kind of proxy data where possible for your system, because if you're using things like global averages, you probably will be pretty far off the mark. There's probably too many assumptions going into that, but it is, I think, also important to remember that it's an iterative process. So you might start off with just using kind of average figures for your whole supply chain, but it's a journey. It's not one of those things you can kind of fix straight away, and it's about really engaging with that and trying to work to improve your data and data capture over time. Yeah, there's plenty more to say on that, but I'll pass over to Giles now, because I know he's got work in that space as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I mean, as you're saying, of an average person's carbon footprint, food and what they eat is sort of normally around third after travel and home, in terms of the makeup of the footprint. And then obviously eating out is an area which they have less control of because they're not making those buying decisions. So I think in getting to net zero, food is a fundamentally important one to solve. And whilst at the SRA, as I said earlier, we're sort of interested in all sustainability issues, social and environmental. The climate change and tackling carbon is the issue of the day, and is one where we all need to focus time and energy on in terms of reducing. And so I think we're seeing more of a focus of it now more than ever, which is great. And the restaurant sector is beginning to get their head around what that means. Most of the net zero work that has happened to date in the food sector has happened with very large corporates, the supermarkets, and food manufacturers. And as Anya says, because it is incredibly complex and that the restaurant sector is a very fragmented sector without many very big players in, it's a difficult one for restaurants to get their head around what they can do to measure their footprint. And that's why one of the initiatives that we've been developing is a protocol for restaurants, which tries to simplify down that complex model and enable any restaurant that doesn't have expertise in this area to be able to go through the process of calculating their footprint, developing a reduction plan, and offsetting the remainder in order to get to net zero. But we're still at early days, as Anya says, and there's lots of aspiration there, and consumers are only really beginning to get their head around the concept. So I think it's a really exciting time at the moment, obviously going towards COP26 and the government's commitment for a 78% reduction by 2035. All of this is sort of part of the sort of increased dynamic around this issue, which means that increasingly all restaurants will need to look very carefully at this and find ways to reduce their carbon and then communicate that on to diners.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one thing, very much kind of echo what Giles is saying, in that, you know, a lot of this is kind of being worked out at the moment, and it really is just the kind of start of this journey. So, you know, it's pretty sort of well established what the kind of scope 1 and scope 2 reductions need to be in order to meet net zero. So that's kind of on an annual basis about a 4.2% reduction, and that's pretty achievable. So certain things like, you know, getting renewable energy suppliers, actually just having more efficient, you know, systems in place can really help to achieve that. Where there is still quite a lot of debate, and really looking forward to Giles's protocol coming out for the restaurants, is around the scope 3 emissions, which include all of the food that's being purchased. So it hasn't really yet been kind of decided, if you like, among, you know, the sort of industry and the rule setters, exactly what those scope 3 reductions will need to look like. But kind of broadly speaking, the sort of ambitions that we're seeing are things like, in line with the Cool Food Pledge, so reducing the emissions of your food by 25% by 2030. That's quite a popular target, but some people are going even further, you know, to try and aim for 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. But yeah, I would say sort of for anyone kind of interested in the net zero narrative, it's definitely one to watch, and to, you know, see what scope 3 targets people are coming out with. And yeah, you know, I think one thing to remember is that it, you know, it isn't going to be business as usual, and it will be a challenging, you know, road for everyone, you know, to go on that journey. But yeah, it's a really exciting time, and you know, we'll all have to take part. So there's lots more to come.
Yeah, sometimes navigating all the regulations and guidelines can be quite a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely. I mean, yeah, some of the kind of, you know, science-based targets initiatives, it's, you know, great because it's all kind of clear and easily accessible. But you know, you find yourself kind of having to dip into 200-page documents, and you know, it's not really something that you know, your average restaurant or average food, you know, really any restaurant will have the time to do. So I think that's why, you know, developing tools like, you know, the net zero protocol, and, you know, the work we're doing as well as making it much simpler for restaurants and food companies to be able to do that. And you just have to have someone in the middle kind of, you know, making that process more simple, because it is a big minefield, and not one I'd recommend kind of dipping into, yeah, unless you really want to kind of dive deep.
One of the criticisms that I've heard around quantitative communication and sustainability calculation is that it's very difficult for smaller businesses to do and to show much of an impact through it, because they don't have the same kind of numbers to crunch. You know, a big business can crunch the numbers in the spreadsheet. They maybe have more time to do that, but they also they can then come out with a really big, impressive number, which perhaps a smaller restaurant might struggle to do. Giles, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I disagree with you, because I mean, we at the SRA, we have a thing called the Food Made Good 50, which is 50 questions that any restaurateur can answer pretty much, for, you know, sitting down at a computer in half an hour, and it will give them a good feel for where they're at as a restaurant. And, you know, they can become a member and they can talk about their membership and they can engage with it, and they can start communicating what they're doing in particular areas with a broader understanding of how good or not, and whether they're managing social and environmental issues. So, you know, I think that we are trying to get to a way that any business, small or big, can at least understand whether they're taking into account some of the social and environmental impacts that a restaurant has. But that doesn't get around the fact that doing our rating, you know, one of the biggest complaints we get from most of our small, you know, single site members is that it's tough. It takes time. And in a sense, you know, sustainability does take time, because you've got to think through these things. You've got to have a point of view. You've got to, when in the past you weren't thinking about them, and then you are having to think about them. It does require some time. So there's no point, I suppose, pretending that it doesn't add more time and complication. But I think one of the things that we feel is that it's not a sort of either or. I think people then start thinking about where they want to get the food from, who they get it from, how they get it from, and then that becomes part of the restaurant that they are and what they're delivering to diners. I see that there's a question about B Corp accreditation, and B Corp. You know, I've been through the process myself. I think it took us 2 years to get B Corp accreditation. You know, these are big commitments for small businesses to do, and I think to Anya's point before about carbon, you know, if we want every business to be managing its carbon, reducing its carbon footprint, and helping us get to net zero, we need to simplify the process down, and so that it isn't as challenging as it is to become a B Corp or other such accreditations. But we can't take out all the hard work, because in a sense, I always see the process as much about an education as it is about an accreditation. So you learn more about what you're doing and the decisions you're making, and how you can affect change through making those decisions differently. If you take all of the challenge out of that and you just hand it on a plate, then you lose that education process that people have during it. So there's a balance between the two.
I think that's something that we've been working on quite hard at Tried and Supplied, working with the SRA and Food Steps as well, understanding what information they need from suppliers to make that, at least that chunk of the work, a lot easier. We now have all of supplier information in the format that answers all the SRA questions on suppliers. You know, that's then exportable, so it's easy at least to fill that amount of information in. And I think there's a lot more that can be done across the industry in terms of aligning on data, and just because at the moment I feel like there's a lot of data input that's required that's quite repetitive, both for suppliers but also for restaurants, and where we can streamline that kind of thing. I think there's a big opportunity to help simplify the whole process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the kind of biggest barriers to a lot of you know, restaurants or food companies engaging in the net zero pieces isn't necessarily just the time, but it is also the money. I mean, currently the only way to really do that is by hiring kind of, you know, independent consultants, which can be really expensive, and you know, you kind of come in and then you get a single you know, process where it could take, you know, 6 to 8 months to kind of calculate all the carbon. Then you get a single report and you're kind of left on your merry way to kind of, you know, implement all of those things. And you know, those reports can cost thousands, if not kind of tens of thousands of pounds. It's just out of the budget for most businesses. And I think there are a lot of, you know, pretty easy wins that we can be doing with better technology around just, you know, the simple things like number crunching, or kind of connecting with supplier systems. You know, we have the technology to do that, and you know, what we're trying to do is build a software that, you know, just makes that a lot easier and cheaper, and it doesn't need to take away that kind of education process which Giles was speaking about, because you know, you still have to go through the thought and the implementation and all of that, but with things like, you know, just the calculations, etc., people shouldn't be paying, you know, kind of thousands of pounds to do that, because we do have the technology to make that side of things much more streamlined, and I think that will really reduce the barriers for a lot of businesses to be able to calculate their footprint, you know, if there are just more affordable kind of tools and software out there to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. I mean, we've just been involved in a project, just to your data point, Dominique. it's not that the data doesn't exist, it's that the data isn't going with the product through the process. So we work with a company called Map of Ag, and they are taking farm data and linking it through the system to get to enable Morrisons in this instance to be able to have the data that's gone through from the farmer to the to the collective, to the distributor, to the it's not that the data in each of those doesn't exist, it's that they're not being able to be brought together in a single system. And as a consequence of that, what, for example, Morrisons is being able to do is commit to all of their owned farms, which is 300 farms, to be net zero by a much earlier date than they're committing for the rest of their products that they buy, because they've got that data flow back through the control of the system. And so, we need to move quickly to use data in a positive way, to really just be able to scrape all of that data into one meaningful process, rather than it all being in separately and having to be re-inputted, which is, as you say, is happening at the moment. So that's not, if we can fly a helicopter on Mars, we should be able to put that data together and then make it usable for the end consumer.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting kind of point there about the tools that opens up, to businesses when you do have that visibility down the supply chain. Because if you don't have that, I mean, what you're kind of stuck with is using average impact data on your food, and then your only options are to actually switch between ingredients. So this ingredient might have a higher carbon footprint than this one. So the only tool I have is to actually change the ingredients that I'm purchasing. Whereas when you actually start to engage with suppliers and hopefully kind of have that bigger visibility down the supply chain, you can actually work within the system that you already have, and more people benefit. So the suppliers benefit, the farmers benefit, all the kind of people in between can be on the same journey. But as you both pointed out, the biggest stumbling block to that now is the fact that the data isn't being kind of matched up in a smart way to kind of transfer all of that up the supply chain. But it is happening. We're really looking forward to working more with you, Domini, to start to pull those pieces of the puzzle together, because it just opens up the toolkit that people have to make positive changes, much more than simply just changing their ingredients alone.
Yeah, I wanted to ask whether there's anything you think as an industry we should be lobbying for to support the industry and make it easier for consumers to make sustainable choices about choosing restaurants. Because one of the things I find is if I'm on Google Maps, for example, and I'm looking to decide where I'm going to go out for dinner, there's no information on sustainability of the restaurants at all. And so even though I might want to make a decision based on the sustainability of the restaurant, it's really hard to do that. Are there things that you think, perhaps Giles, you think would really help restaurants to attract more customers for sustainability in that way?
A beautifully directed question, because you shouldn't be looking at Google Maps. You should be going on to Food Made Good, where you can put in I want to eat in Salisbury, and it will give you a list of sustainable restaurant members within that town. So we've got a kind of a device that can help you make those decisions for you. And we're actually talking to the likes of OpenTable and others about having that data, so that the more usual places that people can go to can get that data. In the end, we want people to make more make sustainability and elements of sustainability to help drive their decision making, but we need the places which they're currently going to make those decisions to see that it's important that they provide that information. Otherwise, the circle isn't quite working. And we're getting there. We're getting closer, but we're not quite there yet. So at the moment, most of the booking platforms are trying to sort of build efficiency still as the most important factor in those, which is so they're trying to make the information work rather than provide a depth of information to enable you to make a better decision. But I do think in the next 3 or 4 years, we will see that fundamentally change, and that increasingly you will be provided with much better data around your decision making about a restaurant, and that will have a huge impact in then driving restaurants to want to have those accreditations, be it around net zero or broader sustainability issues, in order to help people make more informed decisions. So I think it hasn't happened yet. We've always assumed that it would happen, but I genuinely think it will happen in the next few years.
Yeah, I think I mean, one of the things I feel is that Google, it would be so easy for Google to incorporate just a field that said SRA rating, for example, or net zero accreditation. So the information is there. I think they already do things like LGBT friendly or women led. I've seen that on Google Maps. But nothing yet about sustainability. And I feel like it would be such an easy change for them to make, and would make such a big difference. So
we are talking to them. So
hopefully soon.
The process is slow, but
yes, I can imagine getting big businesses like that to make a quick decision when it's not their core business is challenging for sure.
Actually, I mean, to be fair to Google, their head of food, I mean, they take food incredibly seriously at Google. They have probably done more work internally from a sort of behavior change perspective, and a sort of health and supporting their employees in relation to food. So it is something that actually they feel very strongly about. It's very strong in their culture, that the importance of it. And obviously they bought Zagat's in America, the guide, about 6-7 years ago. And I think they recognize that they can and will play a really positive role in helping people make decisions. It's just complicated, and but I think they will get there.
Great. Well, let's hope. I just want to end before we address some of the questions. One last question for you, Anya, around whether there are any examples of where sustainability communication has gone wrong and backfired. I think there were a few examples that you had on that.
Yeah, I think one thing I suppose for everyone to be aware of is that we like to think, and I think in most cases serving more sustainable food, you can have that really positive narrative, and it can all be driving kind of people to feel good about their food choices. But I think one thing that's kind of often overlooked is that the current food that we are eating is inherently unsustainable, and people want to eat unsustainable food. People like to have produce from all around the year at their fingertips, and we are eating far too many kind of animal-based products compared to what we can afford. So there will have to be some tough decisions in the road to net zero around what food is being served. But I think there are some good lessons to learn about how how you can communicate those changes without them backfiring. So a couple of kind of interesting examples that we've come across is in a university context. We did see a massive backlash around things like meat-free Mondays. And even though a lot of the students were saying that they wanted sustainability initiatives, or they wanted to see the catering team kind of taking things seriously in that way, as soon as that campaign came out, it was really quickly scrapped across the university because there was a backlash from the students. And I think that really speaks to people don't want to be kind of told really what they should and shouldn't be eating, and people don't like to feel that options have been taken away from them. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting to do this, but what was interesting is that in some of the university cafeterias, they just stopped serving certain types of food. So they stopped serving beef and lamb, and some people might kind of disagree with that decision, but they did it without kind of, you know, shouting about saying, right, we're having a kind of beef-free or lamb-free menu, and they didn't get any complaints, so people actually didn't notice, and they had you know, really positive kind of uptake of the replacement meals that they were serving. So I think there is a real risk around yeah, that kind of sense that you're taking options away from people, and just being kind of aware that that can often backfire. And then another interesting example is you know, there's been some work looking into how dishes are actually placed on menus. And you might think you're doing kind of a really sort of fantastic thing by highlighting your kind of most sustainable options in a box on the menu, or kind of saying, you know, here's a plant-based option, or here's a kind of really sustainable option. But actually, you know, some evidence has shown that by boxing things on menus, you're actually kind of, you know, making people feel like they're sort of othered in a way, and they don't seem to like that. So when you put things in a box, compared to just having it sort of integrated on the menu, they found that sales of those meals were actually under half, compared to when they were just kind of integrated in a standard menu. And again, I think it is that feeling. No one likes to be thinking, you know, I'm this, you know, type of eater, or you know, I need to kind of eat my food in a box or on a certain sort of meat-free day or whatever. And you know, what they have shown is that kind of positive messaging around meals. So if you have a sustainable meal and you say, you know, this is the chef's selection, or you give it kind of appetizing, you know, descriptions, that tends to increase the sales of those meals, rather than kind of shoving them in a bit of a corner and you know, kind of making people feel like they're in some way sort of excluded, I think.
Perfect.
I think
Giles, yeah.
just one point on that. I mean, I think one of the challenges, and this is a sort of broader sustainability point, but an important one, which is that when you start communicating your sustainability credentials, you are, in a sense, creating a higher expectation for the business. And there are many examples of where that higher expectation is then let down by people thinking, well, hang on a sec, I thought you were good, and now you've done this. Whereas the people who they don't have expectation of do something and they sort of expect them to do bad things. So, you know, in a sense, I think that's quite an important point, which is that you're held to account by your own, you know, values, in a sense, that if you step up to the plate and go, you know, yes, we do care about the world, the planet, people, and we can incorporate that into the way we run our business. You can't put that to one side just because you don't want to do something, or you think that it's not really relevant to you, or whatever it may be. And so, you know, in a sense, if you take the consumer and they come with you and they trust you, you know, you can easily lose that trust by not continuing those values across the board. And I suppose that would be my biggest sort of warning, which is, please, you know, this is important, and you know, there's huge benefits by being more sustainable to the business, not only in how it runs, the, you know, staff engagement, customers coming in, etc. There's just so many benefits to running a more sustainable organization, but you can't just pick and choose when you want to be sustainable or not. Then you will lose the trust of the people around you, and that will fail.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to end on, Giles. It's very important to be true to your values once you've decided what they are. I wanted to just start picking up on some of the questions. We've had some great questions in the chat. One of them from Helen Barrett. Do you have any specific suggestions on tools that can be used to build the anticipation third and the remembering third as part of the consumer's experience? Great question, Helen. Either of you want to pick up on that first?
Well, all I would say is, you know, and it's not something that I'm particularly professional at, but the social media does provide you that engagement before and after that can feel quite personal to the diner. and therefore I think building the experience around that is something that some organizations or restaurants do really well. I would suggest if you go on to Lyle's, I don't know if you know about Lyle's, the restaurant in Shoreditch, which is a brilliant restaurant. If you haven't been, I recommend it highly. But the way in which they engage with their diner, the email engagement in terms of what they're doing, who their suppliers are, getting to know them, the team, where their food comes from, the guest chefs, what's coming up is absolutely beautifully done, and really builds the whole anticipation for the meal, but also enables you to then talk about and pass on recommendations, as I have just done, maybe, and if you go on, you may be part of that process.
Anya, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think that's probably more Giles's remit. I think well answered. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so the next one, I think we addressed the B Corp question. Part of that question was also, does carrying an environmental product declaration carry any weight?
Yeah, so happy to take that one. I think there are, lots of benefits around having levels of kind of accreditation for certain products. I think it is a trade-off again between kind of cost versus coverage, really. So doing a full kind of EPD is incredibly expensive. You could be looking at in the thousands of pounds for each product that you're serving. And I think the question really is, what are you using that information for? Are you using it because you want to kind of show that accreditation, in which case maybe that is sort of money well invested. But if you're using that internally to kind of make improvements, I think it's probably better to go for something which is aligned to still a fantastic standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but which you don't need to kind of go through that really long kind of declaration process, which is incredibly expensive and takes a lot of time. I think increasingly a lot of places again are kind of realizing that the big the big accreditations like this they're most accessible to the big companies who can afford to pay for it. But I don't think that sort of over the next 10 years we'll see kind of massive uptake of these things, because they're just not kind of as accessible and affordable to your average business. So yeah, that probably be my piece. Don't know if Giles has anything to add.
Nothing to add there.
Okay, next question is from Gavin. Do you have any views on the Climate Change Committee 6th carbon budget, in particular the comments on food waste?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts on that. So I mean, I think it's great to have something out there which is ambitious, but also kind of a plan for the future. I think generally kind of on the food front within that, there are some very ambitious kind of assumptions being made. So I think on the food waste piece, I think it was kind of assumed that food waste would be reduced by half by 2030, in line with kind of RAP's protocol. My personal view is that is going to be a massive challenge, and there's certain kind of points within the food system where we're not really measuring food waste very well, or kind of having proper kind of strategies to reduce that. One of the big ones that we've looked at is waste in the kind of supermarket consumer supply chain, and everyone knows a kind of huge amount of food is wasted that's kind of bought and shelved at supermarkets and then in the home. So I think we'd really push for kind of more specific strategies to actually get that down to half, which is massive. There are some other sort of assumptions in that budget. So I think one of them is to reduce meat and dairy consumption by 20% by 2030. Again, that is actually quite an ambitious kind of underlying assumption. We did some work with public sector catering, who've committed to reducing meat by 20%, which is fantastic. But but again, there's loads of work to do there, and it's rolling that out across the entire kind of country is no small challenge, let alone kind of having the right narrative around that, which doesn't kind of demonize people or set the kind of debate alight in a non-constructive way.
We run a number of programs for restaurants, particularly restaurant groups, around tackling food waste. And what's interesting for us is two things. One is that if they haven't focused on it, you can make some really good changes quickly, and then people can see the benefit that comes through in terms of cost saving and food waste reduction. But as Anya says, the first 20% is pretty easy, and then it gets really difficult. And it's one of those things that then if you stop the process, then slowly the food waste starts creeping back up again. And so it's one of those sort of continuous things that you need to keep on going and integrating within the system. But I do think that the commitments that they've made are going to require more than just becoming efficient at using food. I think it is about changing food choices, and actually changing diets, and that's where the real challenge is going to be. And I think everyone, well, not everybody, but there's a will to make it work, but it won't be easy.
Just one last question, if you have time, Anya and Giles, is from Arash Kiani about what about increasing the price for less sustainable menu items, and instead reducing the price on more sustainable items? Yeah,
so actually one of my university supervisors did this exact kind of experiment, at least in a university cafeteria setting. So they looked at making vegetarian meals 20p cheaper and meat meals 20p more expensive. So that's obviously not kind of necessarily less and more sustainable, but kind of roughly speaking a decent measure. So they did find that doing that, so making the vegetarian meals 20p cheaper, increased the sales by 3.2%. So fairly modest, but still in effect. They didn't find that it had any effect increasing the price of meat meals on the menu, at least by 20p. That didn't seem to change people's decisions. So at least from that kind of standpoint, I think it's a tool that possibly could be used, but probably not one that's going to entirely kind of solve the problem in and of itself, unless you kind of went potentially more than 20p either side.
I don't know if any of you heard Ollie Hunter yesterday from he runs the Wheat Sheaf, was talking about vegetables, and that they're the highest margin. If you get it right, they're the highest margin menu option, and they're and cheaper than others. So in a way, hopefully the kind of sustainability choice is baked into just making those absolutely delicious sounding and cheaper inherently than some of the more expensive meat options. The only other thing that I'd say is we are in the net zero restaurant protocol providing an option to restaurants that they can include a carbon charge on the menu, and that carbon charge would increase depending on what you buy, or decrease depending on what you buy. So if you were going out and having a sirloin steak for dinner, your carbon charge, you would pay a larger proportion on the bill than if you had a mushroom risotto, for example. So trying to include some sort of behavioral decision making into that decision. Obviously this is very early days, but I do think that potentially, particularly if we do get carbon pricing coming down the road, which hopefully COP26 may help with, then I think increasingly we could see carbon actually being priced into products, and therefore that will have an impact on people's decision making. If it's more than 20p, which it should be, because a steak is should be much more than mushroom.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting points though is around the price of carbon. So if you look at kind of standard carbon prices now, for something like a steak, you might only be required to add something like 5p onto that if you're kind of using the cheapest offsets. And we, I think there's a kind of responsibility or interesting point around how do we actually add those kind of taxes and carbon values into products, because it needs to be enough to kind of change people's behavior or make them think, but also yeah.
It's very difficult balance to get right. Well, thank you both for such an interesting discussion today. I think we've all learned a lot, and it's great to see plenty of questions coming in the chat. You can also post any more questions in FoodWeb, and I'm sure between us we'll be able to answer them. So thanks very much, everyone, and look forward to the rest of the conference.